Hi, I'm Phil and I'm a late diagnosed autistic older adult. In the last video, we had a look at the autism quotient test for assessing the level of autistic traits and worked through that together. In this video, I want to take that one step further and look at the criteria for diagnosing autism. Specifically, I want to look at the DSM-5, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition. This is the criteria used in many countries, including Australia and the US. In other countries, the ICD-11, or International Classification for Diseases 11th revision, is used, but both are very similar. I will just focus on the DSM-5 as that is what was used in my evaluation. Before we begin, an important point to note. I am not a medical professional, so this information is based on my experiences as an autistic person. This is not medical advice. So firstly, what is the DSM-5? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders 5th edition was produced by the American Psychiatric Association in 2013 and updated in 2022 with the DSM-5 TR or text revision supplement. The DSM-5 covers a wide range of mental health and brain conditions. As it is written from a medical viewpoint, it describes autism from a deficit standpoint, with language which is ableist and pathology-based. It focuses on negative symptoms and either ignores the positive traits or describes those traits as negatives. Also, it appears that it is written with children rather than adults in mind, with examples such as imaginative play or references to things like lining up toys, etc. Despite this negative language, it does describe autism fairly well. The DSM-5 criteria for autism is laid out into 5 sections, each of which must be met in prescribed ways. Criteria A and B also have sub-criteria, all of which need to be met in criteria A, and 2 out of 4 need to be met in criteria B. So let's jump into the detail. Criteria A: persistent deficits in social communication and social interaction across multiple contexts, as manifested by all of the following, currently or by history. 1. Deficits in social emotional reciprocity, ranging, for example, from abnormal social approach and failure of normal back and forth conversation to reduced sharing of interests, emotions or affect, to failure to initiate or respond to social interaction. The term social reciprocity here just means typical back and forth of communication. So some examples in this section might include not knowing when it's your turn to speak in a conversation, finding it hard to start a conversation, difficulties with small talk, understanding what is socially appropriate to say, or oversharing personal details, maybe struggling being in social gatherings for an extended period, info dumping on a topic of interest and not knowing when the other person is bored, not responding with the expected emotion or intensity to the other person's news, whether that's bad or good, or needing to use an unusual amount of energy to engage in social interactions, or possibly finding phone calls difficult. 2. Deficits in non-verbal communicative behaviours used for social interactions, ranging, for example, from poorly integrated verbal and non-verbal communication to abnormalities in eye contact and body language, or deficits in understanding and use of gestures, to a total lack of facial expressions and non-verbal communication. Whew, that's a mouthful. This is where the stereotypical lack of eye contact comes in, but conversely, it might be you make too much eye contact. Or you may be able to force eye contact, but then struggle to hear what someone is saying because making eye contact is so distracting. Maybe you need to look away to hear the person fully. Or you might be fine with eye contact, but struggle to intuitively understand people's body language or understand what someone is feeling by looking at their face. Conversely, you might display facial expressions that seem to a neurotypical person to be odd or out of context to the conversation or situation. Maybe you smile or laugh at bad news. Many autistic people also find themselves trying to consciously mimic other people's body movements and postures in conversations because of a lack of intuitive awareness of how to do that naturally. Maybe you lack an awareness of how much personal space to give the other person, Or maybe you have difficulty judging tone or volume. or have issues recognising faces. 3. Deficits in developing, maintaining and understanding relationships ranging, for example, from difficulties adjusting behaviour to suit various social contexts, to difficulties in sharing imaginative play or in making friends, to absence of interest in peers. Here we get the gist that the diagnostic criteria is written primarily with children in mind, when we see words like imaginative play. More broadly though, some examples in this category might include declining social invitations because of the overwhelm those situations may cause, consistently not initiating contact with friends or family, understanding other people's social motivation, being naive in relationships or being used or abused, and adjusting behaviours to fit different relationships, for example, friends versus authority figures. So to sum up, all three of these points are needed to satisfy criteria A. Criteria B. Restricted repetitive patterns of behaviour, interests or activities as manifested by at least two of the following currently or by history. So to clarify, 2 out of 4 of the following sub-criteria need to be met in Part B. 1. Stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, e.g. motor stereotypies, lining up of toys or flipping objects, echolalia or idiosyncratic phrases. This section is all about stimming, and examples might include leg bouncing, hand movements including hand flapping, finger tapping or clapping, nail biting, skin picking, hair pulling or twirling, rocking or swaying, pen chewing, spinning objects like fidget spinners or everyday objects like pens or paper clips, listening to the same song over and over or watching the same TV shows over and over, making noises like humming sounds or squeaks, toe walking, repeating phrases from TV shows or repeating things other people have said in what's called echolalia, repeating phrases that we have made up in what's called palilalia. And just to be clear, you don't need to have all of these examples, just need to show examples of some of these. Moving on. 2. Insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines, or ritualised patterns of verbal or non-verbal behaviour, e.g. extreme distress at small changes, difficulties with transition, rigid thinking patterns, greeting rituals, need to take same route or eat same food every day. This is all about keeping things consistent and may include having trouble with transitions, difficulty with change, eating the same foods every day, arranging things in a specific order, perfectionism, black and white thinking, rule following, literal thinking, having set routines, preferring to wear the same clothes. 3. Highly restricted, fixated interests that are abnormal in intensity or focus, e.g. strong attachment to or preoccupation with unusual objects, excessively circumscribed or perseverative interests. This is all about special interests. These are interests that, as autistic people, we focus intently on. The phrase excessively circumscribed or perseverative could be reworded as restricted or persistent and repetitive. These interests could be quite literally anything, but some common examples, particularly in childhood, might include things like trains or space, or Barbie dolls or horses. Or maybe it might be focusing on a particular actor or singer. This category can also include collections of objects. Some common ones might be stamps or rocks. In my case, when I was a child, I started to collect Melway's map books, which were maps of the city and suburbs of Melbourne, with each subsequent year's edition having a consecutive number on the cover. Another example from this category can include not wanting to throw away certain items, or even feeling bad for discarding those items and ascribing feelings to them. 4. Hyper or hypo-reactivity to sensory input or unusual interest in sensory aspects of the environment, e.g. apparent indifference to pain or temperature, adverse response to specific sounds or textures, excessive smelling or touching of objects, visual fascination with lights or movement. This section is all about our differences when it comes to our senses by being either over-responsive or under-responsive. Examples here may include being sensitive to loud noises, being overwhelmed in crowded places, either because of the noises or because of the visual overstimulation of lots of movement, being in a social environment where multiple people are talking, or where there is extra background noise, having a narrow range of foods or tastes that can be tolerated, being sensitive to people brushing past, sensitive to certain fabrics. Maybe you are under-responsive to pain, or seek foods with spices or strong flavours. Maybe you find the pressure of things like strong hugs or weighted blankets soothing, or maybe you seek movements like spinning around. Criteria C. Symptoms must be present in the early developmental period, but may not become fully manifest until social demands exceed limited capacity, or may be masked by learned strategies later in life. This is an interesting one, as it means that maybe you may not have been too impacted throughout much of life, but at some point when demands reach a certain threshold, the symptoms or traits become much more noticeable and potentially disabling. This can describe the experience of many late diagnosed autistic adults, myself included. We go through life masking our autistic nature from other people because we learn that people find these parts of us uncomfortable. Often we have been masking for so long that we don't actually realise that we are masking until at some time in later life we reach the point where something happens to cause the autistic traits to come to the forefront. For some people this might be when they have children, or maybe when a job is lost or a relationship breaks. It could literally be anything that brings us to this point. Having said that, the diagnostic criteria requires there must be some memories or other evidence of autistic characteristics present in childhood. We are either born autistic or not, so it must have been present all our life. As an extra point here, if we are autistic, we will always be autistic. It is a lifelong difference, not some curable illness. Ideally, if we still have living parents, they might be able to remember even some small details that may help satisfy this criteria. Maybe it's the memory of siblings that can shed light here. For me, being in my late 50s, I was concerned this might be an issue to get enough detail. But the diagnostician was satisfied with the few memories that I had, along with the few that my parents could also add. Criteria D. Symptoms cause clinically significant impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of current functioning. If someone, particularly an old adult, is trying to come to terms with a personal autism identification, then there is a pretty good chance that the reasons for seeking out this understanding or diagnosis mean that there is a part of life not going so well, or at least being challenged. Also, often co-occurring conditions like anxiety and depression can come in here, as these are often brought about by challenges faced living as an autistic person in a neurotypical world, especially if living as an undiagnosed autistic person. At different points in my adult life, I've found significant areas in which I have not been able to navigate as a neurotypical person would. For example, in my 20s and 30s, I was unable to engage with tradespeople to get essential housing items fixed. As a result, I spent a whole winter one year without hot water. Now, no one else knew about this at the time, and of course I was embarrassed and ashamed that I was unable to do this most basic task to look after myself. But now I fully understand that my undiagnosed autism meant I was unable to navigate the whole process of engaging a plumber to do that work. From understanding how to find the right person, to making the phone call, to communicating when they were on site. And this is just one example of many. Criteria E. These disturbances are not better explained by intellectual disability or global developmental delay. I think this one again is more focused on children. Intellectual disability can sometimes co-occur with autism, so this in itself is not a disqualifying factor. The key point, though, is to ensure that the traits or symptoms aren't best described by the intellectual disability alone. Likewise with a global developmental delay, but I assume this one is more significant in children in terms of judging whether the child has reached developmental milestones. But again, both developmental delay and autism may co-occur. As adults, we are past that developmental period, so I take this point to be a little bit irrelevant in diagnosing us. As part of the diagnosis, a support level will also be assigned. To be more specific, a support level will be assigned for each of the two main categories of social communication and restricted interests and repetitive behaviours. This is determined as part of the diagnostic interview and is a key area where the experience of the diagnostician comes into play in determining what support levels are assigned. There are 3 levels under the DSM-5 criteria, and they are described as follows. Support Level 1, requiring support. For social communication, this is defined as, without supports in place, deficits in social communication will cause noticeable challenges, has difficulty initiating social interactions and demonstrates clear examples of atypical or unsuccessful responses to social overtures of others, may appear to have decreased interest in social interactions. And Level 1 for restricted interests and repetitive behaviours is described as, restricted and repetitive behaviours cause significant interference with functioning in one or more contexts. Resist attempts by others to interrupt restricted and repetitive behaviours or to be redirected from fixated interests. Level 2, requiring substantial support. Under social communication, marked challenges in verbal and non-verbal social communication. Social challenges apparent even with supports in place. Limited initiation of social interactions and reduced or abnormal responses to social overtures from others. Under restricted interests and repetitive behaviours, restricted and repetitive behaviours and or preoccupations or fixated interests appear frequently enough to be obvious to the casual observer and interfere with functioning in a variety of contexts. Distress or frustration is apparent when restricted repetitive behaviours are interrupted. Difficult to redirect from fixated interests. And Level 3, requiring very substantial support. Under social communication, severe challenges in verbal and non-verbal social communication significantly impact daily functioning. Very limited initiation of social interactions and minimal response to social overtures from others. Under restricted interests and repetitive behaviours, preoccupations, fixated rituals and or repetitive behaviours markedly interfere with functioning in all spheres. Marked distress when rituals or routines are interrupted. Very difficult to redirect from fixated interests or returns to it quickly. Also, as part of the diagnosis, you'll be given a range of further tests to complete, which act as supporting evidence for the diagnosis. These will most likely be chosen by the diagnostician to probe certain key areas further. For example, in my diagnosis, the tests used were Social Responsiveness Scale, SRS-2, Camouflaging Autistic Traits, CAT-Q. I was also given tests for depression, anxiety, and a preliminary test for ADHD. These are given to check on wider mental health and to identify further comorbidities. Okay, so I hope that all helps demystifying a bit about autism diagnosis and the diagnostic criteria. I'll leave a link in the video description to a useful checklist I've found online that summarises this quite nicely. Also, in part 2 of my Introduction to Autism video, I got into a bit more detail as to how to prepare for a diagnosis and the process I followed in organising that. If you've found this video useful, please hit the like button. And if you'd like to see more content of being autistic as an older adult, please feel free to subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.